Hello, and thanks for joining me here on The Underground Man. My name is Leandra McBride, and I want to talk about the subject of the roots of religious freedom. Now, what I mean by religious freedom is that we're going to explore the topic of religious freedom and liberty in America to kind of trace the development of this concept, this idea, to see kind of where it comes from. Now, the first question that you may be asking is, well, why does this matter? Well, as any of us who've been paying attention recently have noted, especially with recent cases like the Bruen decision, the Supreme Court has ruled that, at least as it relates to the Second Amendment, that laws with respect to the Second Amendment must be traced to the text, history, and tradition of the United States in the beginning, meaning that it has to be traced to the original founding fathers or the communities that immediately followed after. And it's not just here, however. We find even various other Supreme Court cases where there's often an appeal to the founding fathers and their attitudes and their other writings and their practices in the very beginning to see what exactly was meant even by the First Amendment. As the court noted in the Bruen decision and as well as in the previous Heller decision, the way that we come to interpret and understand matters related to the Second Amendment also has bearing on how we come to understand and interpret the First Amendment. As the court stated in the Bruen decision, the Second Amendment standard accords with how we interpret other constitutional rights, which they went on to explain included the First Amendment. The court further stated that we categorize these historical sources because when it comes to interpreting the Constitution, not all history is created equal. And then they quote the Heller decision in saying the constitutional rights are enshrined with the scope they were understood to have when the people adopted them. And what that is that's simply telling us that what we are in a fight over our founding fathers. In seeking to understand whether religious freedom was ever the intention of the founding fathers, we likewise need to look to the text, history, and tradition of the founding fathers. And so that's where this particular study comes in that I'll be drawing on that same level of analysis to try to find and discover what exactly did the founding fathers mean when they wrote the First Amendment, and whether this has any sort of bearing on the way that it's presently understood with respect to religious freedom and religious liberty. In just one example of this fighting over our founding fathers, it bled into conversations about separation of church and state, which are still relevant to us today. In the case of Billard versus the Board of Education from Topeka in the early 20th century, the court there, the Supreme Court of Kansas, remarked that every pupil who enters a public school has a right to expect, and the public has a right to demand, of the teacher that such a pupil should come out with a more acute sense of right and wrong, higher ideals of life, a more independent and manly character, a higher conception of his duty as a citizen, and a more laudable ambition in life than when he entered. The system ought to be so maintained as to make this certain. The noblest ideas of moral character are found in the Bible. To emulate these is the supreme conception of citizenship. It could not, therefore, have been the intention of the framers of our Constitution to impose the duty upon the legislature of establishing a system of common schools where morals were to be inculcated and excluded therefrom the lives of those persons who possess the highest moral attainments. But another state court would weigh in on the very same issue, very close in time, such as the case with Nebraska versus Skeeve from 1903. The court stated there that the suggestion that this is the duty of government to teach religion has no basis whatever in the Constitution or laws of this state, nor in the history of our people. And so that's what we see as this fight over our founding fathers has even bled into the conversations over the separation of church and state. And therefore, this is the task of the historian to see what exactly the history of the separation of church and state are, especially with respect to religious liberty, and then be informed thereof. As with the other fights for our founding fathers usually leads to, there is an appeal to the beginning of our country, especially with respect to the early colonial era, such as the case with this National Parks article here off to the right here, which frames religious freedom in the context of at least some Puritans, if not all Puritans. The one in the article there makes an appeal to Roger Williams, one of the English American Puritans and Calvinist theologians, as one of the principal agents of religious liberty here in this country. And then usually in this framing, as in the article, it usually paints the Puritans themselves as religious dissenters who leave the homeland because they are upset with the Anglican Church and then seek out some place where they can be free in their own religious expression, and then yet turn to something amounting to hypocrisy by drawing from the very same sources. And then Roger Williams, even though he's a Puritan, they say he was one of the principal agents for pushing religious liberty. And so what we can see is that this fight over our founding fathers usually leads to discussions over religious freedom in the country. And herein is where I make my point of departure. I think, as will be shown throughout the rest of the portion of this video, that though there were people who sought a variety of religious expression in their own home states, they were not looking for religious liberty, and furthermore that this had nothing to do with the First Amendment. But also related to that the source then of religious freedom and liberty as it's understood today should properly be placed among Roman Catholic minorities in the United States who pushed for a more secular society and sought to have a system where they weren't being lambasted with Protestant versions of Christianity in the public square. Now, it is worth noting what the particular situation was with respect to the religious situation in England. In English society, Roman Catholics were a minority religious group. They did have a small enclave, and there was they certainly were allowed to exist. But there were oaths that they were required to take, which forced them to acknowledge the divine right of, for example, King James. The graphic on the left is from a work from 1615, which shows Yahweh up at the top there in the clouds, passing power down to King James. And King James himself was producing works in 1609, although he was doing so under a pseudonym, where he basically argued that he ruled by divine right, Now, it is worth noting the particular situation that Roman Catholics would have found themselves in at this time period. So prior to coming to the British colonies, Roman Catholics, much like the Puritans, they were a minority. They were religious dissenters. But with the Roman Catholics, they had it even worse because they didn't even have the benefit of being Protestants. And at the very same time, King James was producing works which is in 1609, called Like by the King, whereas there is lately published in the print our apology, heretofore made for the oath of allegiance. And so with that, King James was publishing anonymous works where he was arguing that Roman Catholics and others within his kingdom needed to swear an oath of allegiance. And by swearing this oath of allegiance, of course, it would have put Catholics in a really funny position because they would have had to have been acknowledging him as God's divine ruler, something that would have made the Roman Catholics in his society really, really uncomfortable. And so in the graphic that we see on our left side, you can see that there's Yahweh in the center. And this is from a 1615 work, which further argued that King James was the true and noble leader under Yahweh, and you can see Yahweh passing down power to King James. And so he was arguing basically that he was ruling by divine right. Now, with King James and his oath of allegiance that he was forcing his subjects to take, it basically would have told them that they were denying the power of the Pope to depose monarchs. And so if we just think back on the whole investiture conflict that took place earlier in Europe, it becomes quite clear what the motives of King James was when he published these sort of treatises anonymously and asked for people to swear allegiance to it. It was in every sense a religious oath, in as much as it was a political one, because of the history that took place across Europe with respect to popes and monarchs. Protestants like Richard Mockett, writing in 1615, basically showed that Protestants, even religious dissenters like the Puritans, would have come to understand that Roman Catholics were to be subject to Protestant rule, and at the very least needed to be silenced. And just looking at just one portion of the oath which Parliament had drafted up, the Roman Catholics would have had to swear that I do from my heart abhor, detest, and abjure an impious and heretical, this damnable doctrine and position that princes, which can be excommunicated or deprived by the Pope, may be deposed or murdered by their subjects, or any other whatsoever. So such provisions would have been necessarily theological, as they would have put Roman Catholics into a really awkward position of having to swear an oath of allegiance to basically oppose something that the Vicar of Christ may put forth. And so lots of Roman Catholics abhorred this oath well before they even came to the Americas. Now, history demonstrates for us that the Roman Catholics had actually arrived in the place where the English first landed, in Virginia, but they were here almost a century prior to, over 80 years before 1607. And with the establishment of the English Church, however, it meant that there was loads and loads of religious persecution for Roman Catholics in Virginia. When the Roman Catholics started arriving in the British colonies, however, it wasn't until around mid 17th century, around the 1630s. And at that time, Roman Catholics would have been in a minority among the British colonies. Now, the vast majority of persons living in the British colonies would have been Protestants of various different flavors. And so, as you could see from the chart here, the vast majority of Roman Catholics would have been around the area of, let's say, Maryland, and the bulk of pretty much everyone else, they were just different flavors of Protestants. And what this meant was that at the arrival of Roman Catholics into the British colonies, they would have faced immense prosecution. So almost immediately after the arrival of British to the shores of what today is modern-day America, it equaled persecution for the Roman Catholic Church. The vast majority of the people who would have been here would have been some flavor of Protestants, with a very small number of Roman Catholics popping up around the area of Maryland. And we see this sort of thing reflected in various early colonial charters and constitutions. In the Laws and Liberties of Massachusetts of 1634, we actually get a whiff of some of this persecution. And it's probably actually more than a whiff. It's pretty direct. And there's an entire section there on Jesuits which says that no Jesuit or spiritual or ecclesiastical person ordained by the authority of the Pope or See of Rome shall henceforth at any time repair to or come within this jurisdiction. And if any person shall give just cause of suspicion that he is of such society or order, he shall be brought before some of the magistrates, and if he cannot free himself of such suspicion, he shall be committed to prison and bound over to the next court of assistance to be tried and proceed with the banishment, or otherwise as the court shall see cause. And so what you can see is in these early colonial laws and charters and agreements, they were really against even having Roman Catholics present there. And so it was by necessity then that the Roman Catholics, if they were going to arrive here, that they were going to have to establish their own colony. As the British colonies began to take form, Anglicanism was starting to take hold, as majority of the adherents came from England. So when this sort of thing happened, like around the area of Virginia, it sent Puritans and Roman Catholics alike looking for another place to set up. And again, that place that they landed, lots of them was in the area of Maryland. And so when this sort of thing happened, what we get it with the Baltimores, who the Baltimore, Maryland is named after, Lord Baltimore's. They had basically established Maryland, at least originally, as a place for religious freedom for all Christians. This meant that Roman Catholics could have themselves a home. One of the founders of Maryland, well, both of the founders, George and Cecil Calvert, called the Lords Baltimore collectively, or Lord Baltimore respectively. With George Calvert, for example, was actually raised in the Anglican Church and actually was forced to profess faith in the Anglican Church, despite the fact that he was secretly a devout Catholic. His own father had decided to play by all the rules and to profess and follow the faith of the Anglican Church, even though his own mother had been thrown into jail for departing from the Anglican faith and being a Roman Catholic. In 1624, George Calvert actually openly came out as a Roman Catholic at a time when he didn't have to worry about losing any sort of political capital or any finances. His son, Cecil Calvert, on the other hand, so they were the first people to found and to run Maryland as a colony, which was established as a very early home for Roman Catholics in the British system. Thus, there in the Maryland society, as opposed to the rest of Protestant British society, it was in Maryland where religious liberty and freedom really got its start. And primarily because, as John Krugler, one of the eminent historians on the topic, notes, it served multiple purposes. The ultimate reason in Maryland wasn't to bring about religious freedom per se, but because it was financially beneficial as well as cohesive for the entire colony itself if they didn't spend a bunch of time fighting back and forth amongst one another over religion. But in either case, what we have here is we have religious liberty taking hold regardless of the reason, but it being pushed forth by Roman Catholics. Now, the Junior Lord Baltimore was a businessman above all. He was still a devout Roman Catholic, but what he wasn't going to do was to allow religion to disrupt things in his colony that he wanted to be prosperous. And so Baltimore was essentially recruiting for his colony, and what he was doing was he was publishing a series of pamphlets where he assured all of his Protestant brethren that popery was not going to take over the new colony of Maryland. And as a matter of fact, he also expressed, express in chief intention that the point of the colony was to bring to Christ that and the countries adjacent, which from the beginning of the world to this day never know God. And so he sought to draw them in by saying that you don't have to worry about this being some sort of popish establishment, and you can still continue your concerns, as all of our Christian concerns are, with reaching the lost with the truth of the gospel. But the Junior Lord Baltimore was not without his detractors, both of the Protestant and Catholic tradition, because of this. Lord Baltimore ended up having to continue to publish pamphlets where he was answering back even his Roman Catholic brethren, assuring them that their faith would not be stamped out in the colonies. And so in 1634, you had the arrival of Roman Catholics in Maryland with the promise and the hope that they'd be able to practice their faith freely in ways that they weren't able to do in England or in other colonies in the British colonies. In order to secure religious freedom and liberty for the Roman Catholics in the new colony of Maryland, in 1638 they published an Act for Church Liberties wherein the Baltimores state that the freemen of that same holy church within this province shall have all her rights, liberties, and immunities safe, whole, and inviolable in all things, this act to continue till the end of the next General Assembly, and with the consent of the Lord Propriety to be perpetual. And so what we get is you have him concerned, of course, principally with business, but also with his faith, and wanted to guarantee to his concerned brethren abroad and within the colony that they would be protected in practicing their faith. In Lord Baltimore's Maryland, one of the ways in which that he sought to bring about religious freedom was that he was instructing his Catholic brethren to be silent about their Catholicism, especially given the fact that they were so few in number at the very beginning. And so he repeatedly told his Roman Catholic brethren not to arouse the Protestant anger, especially with nearby Virginia. And he also encouraged them the Roman Catholics there, to be tolerant of other positions and not to be so direct about their positions with respect to the Pope and the papacy and Roman Catholicism as a whole. And so thus Lord Baltimore was actually a beacon of religious toleration, starting principally with the fact that he was getting Roman Catholics themselves to not be so dogmatic in their positions. Unlike the colonists in Virginia, Lord Baltimore was very open to the idea of Jesuits coming to his colony, particularly because, as George Morris's confession was in the 1640s, Jesuits had a desire of martyrdom, and this meant that he could expect them to be very tolerant of other particular faiths, and that they could take even a bit of abuse if they came into his colony. Therefore, he could use the Jesuits as a means of establishing a colony for Catholics, establishing a Catholic presence there, but one that would continue to allow for the colony to grow, especially in a time where growth into the colony had been very, very slow. Lord Baltimore then thus represents religious freedom and liberty and religious toleration, but not in the sense that he was pushing for wholly secular society. As he remarks himself, he thought that the colony itself should be a place where the gospel could be preached and in reaching all the nations, and thus his idea of religious liberty and freedom is thus original to the colonies and unlike the other colonies, but not in the sense that he thought that things were going to be without religion. But Baltimore certainly thought that what should take place in the colonies is should be a personal matter of conscience that takes place between individuals, and that you shouldn't have any governing force coming above you telling you that you need to get rid of your religious books or change your practices or anything like that. But he did think that what we should get is we should get the freedom to express our religions as we see fit. Whereas much of the other colonies were concerned with using the courts to exclude persons from even entering into the colony, or if they allowed them into the colony, they weren't going to be allowed to hold office, make lawsuits, anything like that. Lord Baltimore did the exact opposite. And so in this way, he was actually a pioneer. Unlike even his Puritan brethren who may have thought that they needed room to practice their own religious expressions, Lord Baltimore pushed for the religious expression of other people, even when he personally disagreed with them, and even might have thought them damnable heretics. Lord Baltimore then represents one of the attitudes that was pervasive all the way up and through the American Revolutionary War, that didn't see the necessity of a society without religion, that actually saw religion as necessary, but didn't believe that the state should be the one imposing particular religious expressions on you. In 2012, Mara Jane Farrelly published a book called Papist Patriots, in which she argues that the experience of the Maryland Roman Catholics in Maryland and their ideas of religious freedom actually were central to lots of the pushes and arguments, at least among the Roman Catholics in the American Revolutionary War, particularly because they wanted to break from not only the Anglican Church, but also England as a whole, and thus to break the hold of the Anglican Church on the colonies. And so thus, Lord Baltimore represents one of the unsung heroes and I would argue founding fathers of the American experiment, especially with respect to religious freedom. And thus, if we look at his particular views, he was not arguing for anything akin to a secular society. As a matter of fact, quite the opposite. But he was arguing for a society in which people could practice their religion in accordance with their own conscience without being arrested or tried or brought before the courts.